Timeline Thickening by Elroy Cohen. Time machines actually aren't all that revolutionary. Obviously they could be, but with all of the strict laws and regulations that came out once they hit the market, it pretty much rendered them useless. The government was so concerned about timelines being changed in some drastic way, like altering the outcome of a presidential vote, that they abolished nearly all physical interactions for time travelers. It made it pretty much like watching TV, and took most of the fun out of it. In fact, once the newness of the discovery was gone, people pretty much stopped using them altogether. I, on the other hand, found some things you could do without getting in trouble, and since I was one of the few suckers who shelled out the astronomical fee before any of the restrictions were put on it, I kept using mine, if only to justify it to my wife, who was extremely annoyed with my extravagant purchase. I did little things that worked out to her advantage. Things that all went under the government's radar. I went back and made sure our loud neighbors didn't find the house next door as appealing as it was. So instead of buying it and becoming the most obnoxious neighbors to ever live, the place stayed vacant, and eventually it dropped in price so much that I could pick it up for a steal, and the garden of my wife's dreams could be created. With that, and some other things that worked out in my favor, like going back and making sure we didn't pick up that stupid SUV that we drove, Ellen eventually stopped nagging me to get rid of it. That's when I started to experiment with things that worked out in my favor. Ellen and I had been married for 4 years. We were high school sweethearts that met again after college and rediscovered our feelings after that. I was a mix of geek and jock, fairly athletic, with a personality that fit more into the Star Trek-loving crowd than the NFL one. I was fit and smart, enough so that I landed a decent job in R&D for a respectable company. Ellen was the popular party girl. With her cute face and subtle curves, she didn't need much for smarts. She partied through college, picking up a few tattoos and a smoking habit along with her degree, and settled into an entry-level corporate gig. Married life and a sedentary job accentuated Ellen's curves to a bit more than subtle. Her ass became a bit fuller and much flabbier than back in her high school days. It wasn't a big deal. Well, not negatively anyway. In fact, I quite appreciated it. More than I thought I would have. After a lifetime of avoiding chubbiness, I changed my tone pretty quickly once it was on my wife's ass. I can't explain it, but there's an undeniable appeal to the sight and feel of extra soft flesh that started to accumulate into Ellen's rear. Believe it or not, some days I had kicked around the idea of helping her along the road, maybe a couple of pant sizes bigger than she already was. The thought, though, of putting any kind of effort into something that would take months to come to fruition made me toss the idea out the window. Until one day late spring, Ellen came into my office where I had been working for a few hours already. She often wandered in as she rolled out of bed and brought a fresh cup of coffee and chatted a bit before heading off to her job. She had on a pair of shorts that she must have pulled out of the closet from last season. They looked noticeably tight around her rear, and even tighter as she sat down.
Nothing makes a girl feel bad about her figure like putting on old clothes.
I looked up from my laptop at her thighs oozing out of the bottom of the khaki shorts. Looks fine. They'll last you another season. She grinned, a bit relieved,
I'm lucky you don't mind me a bit thicker, or else I'd have to think about dieting or even worse, exercise.
I chuckled. Yeah, think being the key word there, and not actually do it. Ellen huffed and pulled out a cigarette.
Whatever. Can you imagine what I'd look like if you had let me quit smoking for the wedding? I'd have to sew 2 pairs of these shorts together to cover my fat ass.
I rubbed my chin thoughtfully, as my gaze moved from Ellen's chubby thighs to my time machine. Ellen finished her coffee and cigarette and came over for a few minutes of kissing and fondling before heading off to work. I kneaded her cheeks, admiring their softness and wondering what they would look like if I hadn't warned her against doing something as stressful as quitting smoking so close to our wedding. I tried to keep focused on my work. I telecommuted a few meetings and finished some paperwork before catching a glimpse of my time machine out of the corner of my eye.
Can you imagine what I'd look like if you had let me quit smoking for the wedding? I'd have to sew 2 pairs of these shorts together to cover my fat ass.
My wife's words echoed in my head over and over. And soon, I replied to her rhetorical question. Ellen, dear, I don't have to imagine. I used the time machine to go back 4.5 years, and instead of advising against quitting smoking during a time as stressful as wedding planning, I agreed that maybe it was time to kick the bad habit. It wasn't much of an action, probably didn't even show up on the government's radar at all, but the effects were definitely noticeable. The morning played out again. Ellen wandered into the office as usual, only this time, instead of just carrying coffee, she carried a plate of donuts. And instead of being dressed in khaki shorts, she came in her underwear. Her half-naked form let me take in her wider caboose. By my best guess, she was likely 30 pounds heavier than her smoking self had been on that same morning. There was a double chin, a soft pale belly, but most of the bulk was stored below the waist. Her hips were wider, with a hint of what looked to be saddlebags and another 20 pounds or so. Her ass was bigger and now a bit dimpled, and there was some definite jiggle in each of her steps. She again sat on the couch, this time starting in on a large pastry instead of a cigarette.
Oh God, these are good,
she said, and took another big mouthful. I looked up and raised an eye at how her paunch covered her panties.
Oh, no lectures, please. I know I shouldn't. I pulled out some shorts from last season and couldn't get them up past my thighs.
I shrugged. Well, I got a few minutes before my first meeting. If you want me to help you burn off some calories before you head off to work. Ellen winked and stuffed the rest of the donut into her mouth. She turned so that she was on her knees on the couch, flashing her big, wobbly rear. And I was over there in a flash, slapping at it until it almost wobbled her right off the couch. She ended up being a tad late for work. Afterwards, I gave a passing thought to going back and returning things to their original state. But I talked myself out of it, seeing as how things had worked out pretty well. In fact, I didn't think I would need to go back for anything more for a while. Or so I thought. It took some time to see just how much had changed from my one simple action. The closet was full of pants in the 12 and 14 ranges, rather than the 8s I was used to seeing her in. All the special teeth whiteners were gone from our bathroom, as well as all the lighters that used to be scattered around the house in various smoking locations. Our wedding pictures on the mantel now showed a slightly chubbier bride, as a fair amount of the extra weight she carried was likely a result of the crazy stressful period leading up to the wedding. I noticed in a couple of the pictures, with the bridal party, Ellen looked quite a bit full-figured next to her sister, Jane. Ellen noticed it too. Jane was a wild one, just like her sister, but never had any of the curves to show for it. Ellen always resented that, and as expected, now that the disparity between them was even greater, Ellen looked upon the pictures and sighed every time she passed them. I felt somewhat selfish, watching my wife mope past her wedding pictures, as I enjoyed her fuller backside bouncing behind her that was in part my creation. I wondered if there was anything I could do. In minutes, I was walking back to the time machine and mulled over the options. Jane scraped by working at a bookstore. She got the job right after high school by sheer chance and was never motivated to do anything else. She mooched off coffee from the shop while reading magazines and avoided helping any customers. I walked into my time machine with a plan in place. It didn't take much to turn her chance application at the bookstore into a local pizza joint. History was altered, and instead of slurping free coffee while reading, Jane was now sucking down free sodas while eating. I jumped forward in time, and sauntered to the mantel to look at the wedding pictures. A few years in the pizza business turned the scrawny 100-pound image of Jane in a baggy dress into a very corpulent one that was close to 180 pounds, breasts straining the pink fabric of her dress, thick middle bulging out. 2 extra chins and the chubbiest of round cheeks made Jane almost unrecognizable to the eyes of those who were not used to her alternate form. Ellen, however, seemed very used to it, as she made a point of snickering at the image whenever she walked by. I was in heaven with my now non-smoking, overweight, food-addicted wife. Watching her ass bounce around the house in tight clothing as she snacked at a pace that would put her into plus sizes in no time gave me a renewed passion for Ellen, in turn sparking self-confidence and sensuality in her. She would saunter around the house in nothing but a thong and a tank top, teasing with a walk that would ripple her pale bottom. For a while, I didn't see how things could get any better. And then the day came that Ellen made an offhanded comment about her physique as she examined herself naked in the mirror. It was after a particularly intense session in the bed. Ellen's soft cheeks were still slightly reddened, and I was still recovering in bed as she cupped her modest chest.
I can't believe how small my tits are,
she thought out loud.
You'd think a benefit of being chubby would be a decent rack, but I still have the little bumps I had in high school.
She was exaggerating a bit. In high school, they were downright flat. But her pliable little B-cups were hardly noteworthy. Even as she squished them together in front of the mirror, her wide hips only made them seem smaller in comparison. I rolled to my side and smirked. The way you've been eating lately, babe, I wouldn't worry. They'll get fatter one way or another. Ellen shot me a look.
Very funny. No one in my family's blessed with big boobs, so I guess it's hereditary. I just always wonder if maybe I shouldn't have gone and done the clinical testing my roommate did back in college.
I perked up. What's this now?
Oh, it was back when we were apart. I had a roommate who was even more broke than I was, so she volunteered for the testing of some all-natural breast enhancers. She went in for the summer and average C cup and came out 2 grand richer, 35 pounds heavier, and a bursting out of an F cup.
I was sprinting to my time machine as soon as Ellen headed off to the kitchen for a snack. I had to jump a couple times to find the exact date of the trial, but once I had it, I jumped a couple more to intercept a few of Ellen's parents' letters that contained money for her out of her mailbox. As I suspected, it was enough to make her accept her roommate's offer to join her for the summer. I jumped back in time to re-enjoy sex with the alternate timeline Ellen. And oh god, she was huge. Her fat tits flopped around like water balloons as she rode me and swayed violently as I pounded her from behind. Afterwards, I watched with great interest as she sauntered to the mirror to examine herself. My eyes took her all in. She was bigger all over. Probably another 30 pounds at least. Her ass was clearly dimpled all over, and her thighs touched further down. Her belly stuck out a tad further, but her chest was in another realm. She was much more than a handful, with stretch marks radiating out from her pink nipples, likely due to the rapid growth she had experienced during the test. Her self-evaluation was much different.
I need to get better bras. The girls are starting to sag.
I don't think there's any way those puppies won't sag, Ellen.
Oh, like you don't love my F-cup wonders,
she said, hoisting them the best she could. I didn't say I didn't. I just noted that fat, heavy knockers like those are going to sag no matter what you holster them in.
Well, I gotta find something because my back is killing me.
Ellen twisted and turned, sucking in her gut as she evaluated her rack from all angles.
I bet you don't even remember back when I was tiny-tittied.
I couldn't help but smirk. Yeah, vaguely.
Don't laugh. If I would have kept my old cup size, I might have had less of the other bulk that you tease me about so much.
She grabbed a handful of belly fat.
It's harder to exercise with 10-pound weights hanging off your chest.
And with that, she walked off to the kitchen for her post-sex snack. After that, I was sure I was done time traveling to enhance my wife's figure. With her ass on the verge of outgrowing her size 18s, and a chest that needed special F-cup bras, I was pretty well set with eye candy. Ellen's thighs would jiggle in a strong breeze. Her larger assets gave her an exaggerated sense of sexuality. She loved to find new ways to incorporate them into bedtime. She would lotion up her thighs and then slide me in between them like a sausage into a bun. And as much as I enjoyed the new Ellen, there were some negatives. She was even more adverse to activity than she had been. The old Ellen would put up with standing in the outfield and making a few wild swings at the plate for softball season. New Ellen, though, preferred to sit in the stands with a beer. Her bras cost a small fortune, specially made and available in very few places. It made it a pain when she wore out any of her boulder holders. Ellen was also more self-conscious in public. At home, she thought nothing about walking around in a bra and panties. But once she left the house, she was riddled with anxiety about what others thought. After running into one of my exes, I heard about it for weeks, about whether or not I found her more attractive than Ellen. The ex wasn't exactly thin, but closer to average than Ellen for sure. In the end, if any of these negatives got under my skin too much, I could have always gone back into my time machine and altered things to make Ellen slender. But I didn't. In fact, I did the opposite. I kept looking for opportunities to go back and add more curves to my already over 200-pounder. Some were more extravagant than others, and some could have been done without traveling back in time at all, but I like the implied immediacy of time travel. Coming back to a certain point in time, where I had just watched her in one weight, only to watch her again at a heavier one, was almost addicting. Even if the setup was sometimes more trouble than it was worth. After hearing Ellen confess a weakness for pecan pies, I traveled back a few years just to enroll her into a Pie of the Month club. Of course, I upgraded to Pie of the Week and selected dozens of variations on the pecan theme, and then jumped back in time to reap the rewards. The altered Ellen had developed an addiction for the sorts of pie, and had continued long after the membership ended, and a much thicker belly roll when she sat down, on an ass that was adorned with a greater amount of cellulite and a couple big lumps. One of the crazier ideas I had was when I jumped back in time to fatten up Ellen's mom. I had read a study that claimed that a baby born to an obese mom was 95% more likely to be morbidly obese by age 30. I spent countless hours running back in time to creatively tempt Ellen's mother, until she gained 70 pounds by the time she waddled into the delivery room, as opposed to the 25 she had in the original timeline. The results were less than stellar. I noticed very little difference in Ellen after the trip. Hit or miss, I kept at it. It became my obsession, and soon my previously 130-pound wife, who struggled to loose the few extra pounds clinging to her rear, was a 250-pound glutton, whose ass spread to the width of at least 3 people when she bent down. Ellen was a sight when she came home from work, shuffling in on her kitten heels, with her feet swollen over the sides, her hips straining a pair of business slacks, with her choice of underwear outlined against the fabric. She had given up on skirts because of the chafing. Her breasts gapped the buttons on her plus-size blouse and bounced with each step, despite the massive bra meant to minimize movement. Her face was fat, but not so much so that the beauty I had fallen in love with has disappeared. As she walked in, I hurried over and kissed her cheek, as she panted from the effort of walking in past the parking spot. She immediately undid her blouse and slacks, letting her flab ooze free from the constraints.
Do my boobs look swollen to you?
I looked hard at the deep line of cleavage formed under her chins, and shook my head. No.
Well, I've got asked again if I was pregnant, so I thought maybe they were bloated a bit.
Maybe it's that shirt. It shows off your belly a bit. I patted the paunch that was damp with sweat. Ellen sighed and plopped down on a chair, where she kicked her shoes off.
Whatever. It's almost fall, so I can pull out all my baggy sweaters and not have to worry about it for a few months anyway. Not that I care what anyone thinks except you. You have to get in bed with it every night. If you don't like it, you can starve it off me.
There seemed to be a look of knowing in her eyes as she spoke. Just a glimmer. Just for a second. I knelt down in front of her and pushed her legs apart for her flab to spill between before I gently kissed it. You know better than that, I whispered between pecks.
It doesn't matter anyway. They'll have someone else to talk about for a while,
She said, as she leaned back and closed her eyes. Oh, yeah? I stood up and moved behind her, where I started to massage her strained shoulders.
Molly came back from her stint at the European headquarters. She gained at least 40 pounds. She said it was fancy dinners every night. There was no way she could have avoided it.
Oh, really? The same one you passed up? I mused.
Yeah, the one you didn't want me to be away that long for.
So once again, I was in the time machine. Not long after straining my memory to remember the time Ellen had passed the opportunity, by chance, I happened upon something very odd. I was heading to our bedroom on one particularly random night. I was off, way off, as far as where I wanted to be. I had jumped too far, but felt the need to take a peek and see Ellen before all my time altercations, just for old time's sake. As I got closer to the bedroom, something very peculiar happened. The air became thick, and things started to take on an orange hue. I immediately knew what that meant. I was in the proximity of another time traveler, from a different timeline. It was only dangerous if the two travelers touched, because while two timelines overlapping in the same instance was just time travel, a third converging at the same point could cause some severe consequences. I peeked around the corner, and almost dropped over what I saw. Ellen and I were in bed, fast asleep, while another Ellen stood over me with some kind of headphones over my ears. It was a more slender Ellen, very close in size to the one sleeping in bed. She must have been from a timeline before I started messing with things. The whole shock of the situation, of my wife obviously going behind my back to use the timeline to do something to me, had a hypocritical me incensed enough to gain contact with a time-traveling Ellen. "What in God's name are you doing?" I whispered, very loudly. Ellen jumped about a foot in the air. I had stayed by the door, ensuring no physical contact would be made.
Oh, don't be mad. I'm doing this for her marriage,
she said, darting over to me. After stopping her and reminding her of the dangers of physical contact, I let her continue to explain just from outside the bedroom.
I just felt bad about my figure lately. I started to put on a little weight that I don't seem to have the knack to lose. You know me with diet and exercise, and I've noticed you noticing it. In bed and when I'm wearing tight pants, so I thought I'd try to make use of the time machine to subliminally alter your perception of beauty before I even start to get chubby, so it won't be an issue.
My sudden affinity for extra weight all started to make sense.
It'll just be easier for both of us. I won't have to worry about you being unhappy or leaving me because of my weight, and you'll actually enjoy it.
In truth, I was relieved. Not just to know the reason for my preference, but also to know my wife wasn't doing anything nefarious. The logic was still a bit off, though. You could have just subliminally changed your thinking to an exercise-loving nutritionist, couldn't you have? Ellen's face scrunched into an expression of deep thought, one she didn't use much.
Oh, well, I guess I could go back and...
The thought almost made me gag. I mentally reprimanded myself for even proposing the idea, even if it was more logical. Of course, if you want the subliminal message to take, you'll have to go above and beyond. Even as I was correcting Ellen's faulty logic, I saw an opportunity.
Huh?
I made up a story rather quickly. Oh, yeah. If you're gonna go back in time and do subliminal messaging, you're gonna have to go to the extreme. Otherwise, by the time it gets back to our original timeline, it'll have diluted down. It was utter nonsense. But I hope the confidence in which I was delivering it sold my more simple-minded wife.
Really?
Oh yeah, if you want me to appreciate your slightly fuller figure, you gotta make sure the message is for the appreciation of a much, much fatter form than you'll ever be. Ellen looked at the headphones on the sleeping me's head.
I suppose I could re-record it real quick. So if I want you to like my chubby bottom, I have to program you to like me so big I'm nearly immobile?
Yeah, something like that. Now, I better get going. The longer we're both here in the same timeline, the more we risk something bad happening. I hurry off, before she could think of what I was actually doing there. In truth, I wasn't sure what would happen. I was fairly certain her subliminal messaging had worked, but I wasn't sure ramping it up would do anything at all. But if a little appreciation was good, a lot could only be better. I jumped back in time to the point just before Ellen got home from work, very much expecting the same overweight Ellen waddle on her own kitty heels. Boy, was I surprised. First thing was the array of food laid out on the table. It looked like I'd prepared a Thanksgiving feast. Second was the sound of Ellen coming through the door. She sounded about ready to collapse. She was panting and gasping. I hurried over and my jaw hit the floor. Ellen's hips almost wedged in the doorframe as she shuffled in. There were no heels on her bloated feet, just flats that never left the ground. The stretchy maternity pants slacks looked like leggings on her globular legs, partially obscured by a sagging belly apron on top that would have won first prize at any melon growers competition. Amazingly enough, her belly stuck out even further than her boobs. She was pouring sweat and hunched over as she moved toward the couch. As she looked up at me as she passed by, her face was so fat that she was almost unrecognizable. My 250-pound Ellen was now a whopping 423 pounds. A fact I knew for sure somehow, although I could barely think, because just watching her struggle over to the couch had me sporting a rock-hard boner that was impossible to hide. Ellen sighed as she saw me coming toward her with my wood.
Please, you know I need to eat after work before I do anything else.
She was adjusting to pull the elastic waist down over her belly. The blotchy, pale mess flopped onto her lap, and I almost lost it. I hurried to the kitchen to get some of the food. As I did, memories that I never had started to flood my head. 8 meals a day, 21,000-calorie feeding schedules, and various powders, pills, and hormones at my disposal in various hidden locations in the kitchen. I hurried to gather up a belly-busting offering for Ellen, with the anticipation of watching her shovel it in her fat face, almost driving me mad. Clearly, my tip to Ellen to go all out with the subliminal messaging was showing its full effect. I had become a fat, obsessed feeder, so intent on feeding my wife as big as possible that I cut no corners to get there.
I can't believe how hungry I am,
Ellen announced, as she ate herself into immobility. Her many rolls and soft paunch swelled into a massive, round orb as she ate impossible amounts, thanks to a stomach stretched from years of overeating and a healthy dose of appetite enhancers. With Ellen trapped on her supersized couch, from her overindulgence I took the liberty of lotioning up her stretched belly skin, while making sure to give attention to her sensitive nipples. She was moaning and panting and begging for attention by the time I had the forefront good and shiny. With care, I eased her onto her side and carefully maneuvered through the many globs and crevices to get to the treasure spot. With my libido temporarily satiated and Ellen snoring on the couch, I had time to think about what I had inadvertently caused. The bad advice I had given had turned me into someone who probably went to any length to turn Ellen into the obese blob she was. Clearly, both time travel and practical means had been applied, meaning she likely had been too large to even think about going back in time to rectify her error. Clearly, if things continued on this fashion, Ellen would be bedridden in no time. Unless, of course, I went back in time and altered things to prevent the massive expansion of my loving wife. I looked over at the quivering mound that was Ellen, her distended belly sticking out like a small planet, while her breasts sagged like jelly-filled shopping bags under her many chins. With a sigh, I got up and headed back to the time machine, where I unplugged it and threw a tarp over it so it wouldn't get dusty. Then went back out into the kitchen to prepare a snack for Ellen. She always liked a snack before bed. I also remembered to put plenty of weight gain powder in the already calorie-laden treat.